Melissa Davenport, 38, the powerful CEO of a rising tech empire, stood beside her sleek silver Jaguar with its hood popped open, eyes flashing annoyance. Her assistant hovered nearby, embarrassed, while a small crowd of suited executives gathered to watch the spectacle. "Look at this thing," Melissa scoffed, gesturing toward the smoking new engine. "Millions in revenue, cutting-edge innovation, and I'm stranded because of this." She wrinkled her nose as her gaze fell on the man kneeling by the car. Marcus Cole, 35, a tall black mechanic with grease-stained overalls, had arrived from the modest repair shop down the street. His hands, rough and strong, moved with calm precision over the tangle of wires and steel. Melissa crossed her arms and let out a laugh sharp enough to cut glass. "Tell you what, Mr. Mechanic," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "If you can fix this engine, I'll marry you." The executives roared with laughter. Phones came out, recording the moment. The CEO humiliating a man who worked with his hands. To them, it was entertainment. To Marcus, it was another reminder of a world where dignity was too often stolen with a smile. But he didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He looked up, his dark eyes steady, and said simply, "Engines don't care about titles, ma'am. They just need someone who knows how to listen." Something about the way he said it made the laughter fade, though no one admitted it. Melissa rolled her eyes, brushing off his words like oil on her designer blouse. To her, he was nothing more than a joke in coveralls. But to Marcus, this wasn't about pride. It was about proving something deeper. That value doesn't come from power suits or corner offices, but from resilience, skill, and heart. As his wrench turned and the smell of burning faded into clean gasoline, Marcus felt more than metal shifting into place. He felt the weight of every time he'd been underestimated, every time the world laughed at a man who worked with his hands instead of spreadsheets. And when the Jaguar roared back to life, the sound silenced the crowd. Melissa's smirk faltered. She hadn't expected him to succeed, and she definitely hadn't expected the words that followed. Words that would unravel her world, test her pride, and change both of their lives forever. Melissa Davenport had built her empire from steel and stubbornness. At 38, she was a household name in the tech world, hailed as a self-made powerhouse who shattered glass ceilings with stilettos sharp enough to cut through concrete. Yet beneath the magazine covers and the Forbes lists, Melissa carried a reputation as cold, dismissive, and ruthless. She had learned early that in order to win in a man's world, softness was a liability, empathy a weakness. So she laughed loud, spoke sharper, and reminded everyone, especially men who underestimated her, that she owed her rise to no one. Still, the truth was more complicated. Melissa's rise came with sacrifices. Relationships crumbled under the weight of her ambition. Family ties loosened, replaced by board meetings and endless strategy sessions. She wasn't lonely, she told herself, just focused. But sometimes in the quiet of her penthouse overlooking the city, the silence pressed too heavy, reminding her that success couldn't hold your hand at night. Marcus Cole's world could not have been more different. 35 years old, he ran a modest auto repair shop inherited from his late father. His hands were calloused, his clothes worn, but every tool in his shop carried a story. He remembered being a boy, standing at his father's side as they rebuilt their first engine together, learning that cars, like people, could break down from neglect, but with patience and care, they could be brought back to life. Marcus had dreams too, though not gilded in skyscrapers. He wanted to expand his shop, to train young people from his community, give them the skills and confidence to find honest work in a world that too often overlooked them. But every time he applied for a business loan, doors closed. Every time he pitched his ideas, skeptical glances followed. In his city, a black mechanic with a vision was still seen as less than. The day he arrived in that corporate parking lot wasn't just another call, it was rent day. His shop had been struggling. One more missed payment, and the landlord would push him out. So when the call came for an urgent, high-paying service, he grabbed his worn toolbox and hurried, not knowing he was walking into a scene that would pit dignity against derision. Melissa hadn't meant for her words to echo the way they did. "If you can fix this engine, I'll marry you." It had started as a joke, a cruel one, meant to draw a laugh from the men around her. But deep down, there was something more. She had grown accustomed to men trying to impress her with charm or wealth. Here stood a man who didn't flinch at her mockery, who looked at her not with fear or adoration, but with unshaken calm. And that unsettled her. As the jaguar purred back to life, a wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. Embarrassment, because she had underestimated him. Irritation, because he had succeeded where she expected failure. And something else, faint and unfamiliar. Respect. The executives quickly dispersed, muttering jokes under their breath, but Melissa lingered, staring at Marcus as he wiped the grease from his hands. "You got lucky," she said, her tone sharp but weaker than before. Marcus simply nodded, loading his tools into the truck. "Engines don't do luck," he replied. "Just work and time." It wasn't the words themselves that unsettled her. It was the way he said them, as if speaking of something larger than a car. That night, Melissa found herself replaying the scene, the humiliation, and his calm. Why did it linger in her chest like a stone she couldn't dislodge? She told herself it was anger, but somewhere beneath the pride, a seed had been planted. For Marcus, the job was supposed to be just another paycheck, but the image of that CEO mocking him, then watching her world crumble as the engine roared back, stayed with him. Not because of the cruelty. He was used to that. What haunted him was the look in her eyes at the end, fleeting but undeniable. For just a moment she had seen him, not as the mechanic, not as a man to laugh at, but as someone who mattered. Neither of them knew it yet, but that encounter wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a collision between two worlds, one built on privilege and pride, the other on grit and perseverance. And when those worlds collided again, neither Melissa nor Marcus would walk away unchanged. Melissa Davenport was the kind of woman who filled a room before she even spoke. At 38, the headlines called her the Queen of Tech, the self-made CEO who transformed an idea scribbled on a diner napkin into one of the fastest-growing companies in the country. Reporters marveled at her intellect, her boldness, her precision. But the stories rarely captured the other side of Melissa, the relentless edge that cut through anyone who doubted her, the sharp laughter she used like armor, the way she treated respect as something to be demanded, not offered. Her life was skyscrapers, boardrooms, deals worth millions signed with strokes of her pen. She had learned long ago that in a world of men in tailored suits, softness was a liability. If you want to lead, her mentor once told her, you can't blink first. So Melissa trained herself never to blink, never to bow, never to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her hesitate. But success had its shadows. Behind the magazine covers, behind the awards that glittered on her office shelf, were the costs. Friends she'd left behind, relationships that withered because her calendar was filled with meetings instead of birthdays. Lovers who said they couldn't handle her hunger for more. She had everything she thought she wanted. The corner office, the penthouse apartment, the recognition of a world that once ignored her. But in the silence of night, when the city lights twinkled beneath her window, there were moments she caught herself staring into the dark, wondering why the victory sometimes felt hollow. Marcus Cole's life ran on a different track entirely. 35 years old, he carried grease on his hands like a badge of honor, the same way his father had before him. His shop, Cole's Auto, sat on a corner in a neighborhood too often forgotten by developers and city planners. The walls were chipped, the sign above the garage door faded, but inside the shop, every socket wrench, every oil-stained rag, every rebuilt engine carried the memory of his father's laughter and lessons. He could still remember being 8 years old, standing on a stool to peer under the hood while his father showed him how pistons moved, how engines breathed. "Cars are like people, son," his father had said. "They break down if you don't care for them. But with patience, with steady hands, you can bring them back to life." Those words had stuck with Marcus all his life, not just in mechanics, but in everything he did. Marcus had big dreams too, not skyscrapers or headlines, but something that mattered to him. Expanding the shop, hiring apprentices from the neighborhood, giving young people skills that could open doors. He wanted his shop to be more than a business. He wanted it to be a place of opportunity in a world that too often left kids from his community behind. But each time he applied for loans, bankers looked at his worn clothes and raised eyebrows. Not enough collateral, they said. Not enough growth potential. The doors always closed a little too quickly. The morning he drove to the corporate tower, toolbox rattling in the back of his truck, Marcus carried more than just tools. He carried the weight of rent overdue, the pressure of bills stacked on his kitchen table. The shop was on the edge, and he knew one more missed payment could mean losing everything his father left him. So when the urgent service call came through with the promise of good pay, he didn't hesitate. He needed this job. Melissa had been in the middle of a performance that day, though she wouldn't have called it that. Executives from a potential partner company had gathered in the tower's gleaming lobby, suits pressed, shoes polished. Melissa was there to close a deal, to prove once again that her sharpness was not a mask, but a weapon. So when her Jaguar sputtered and died in the parking lot, the timing couldn't have been worse. The group stood around awkwardly as she made the call. When Marcus pulled up, stepping out of his old truck in his grease-stained coveralls, Melissa felt the irritation rise in her chest. This was what she had to deal with in front of her potential partners? A man who looked like he belonged in a dusty back alley, not a polished lobby. And then, as though to mask her own discomfort, she said it. "If you can fix this engine, I'll marry you." It came out sharp, laced with the laughter of the men around her. She hadn't planned it. It was instinct, a jab to protect her pride. The executives chuckled, some shaking their heads, others smirking at the cruelty. Melissa smirked too, convincing herself it was just banter, just harmless. But the moment the words left her mouth, she felt the sting of something she didn't expect. Guilt. Marcus looked at her, calm, unflinching, as if he'd heard words like that too many times before. He didn't rise to the bait. He didn't argue. He just bent over the engine, hands moving with quiet focus, like the car was the only voice in the conversation that mattered. Minutes passed. The executives grew restless, some muttering under their breath, and then, with a turn of the key, the Jaguar came to life, the engine humming smooth and steady. The laughter stopped. Melissa's smirk faltered. She hadn't expected him to succeed, not so quickly, not so effortlessly. The men shuffled away, some with awkward smiles, some trying to change the subject. Melissa stayed behind, staring at Marcus as he wiped his hands. She wanted to say something sharp, something that restored her power. "You got lucky," she muttered finally, though the words felt weak even to her own ears. Marcus didn't even look up. "Engines don't do luck," he said quietly. "Just work and time." He closed his toolbox, loaded it into the truck, and drove away. That night, Melissa replayed the moment in her mind. She told herself she was angry, angry that he had made her look foolish in front of her partners, angry that he had walked away without giving her the validation she was used to. But somewhere underneath the anger, there was something else, something she wasn't ready to admit. Respect. Marcus didn't think much about Melissa after that. To him, she was just another person who had looked down on him, another reminder of how the world saw men like him. But her face lingered in his mind, not because of her cruelty, but because of the flicker he had seen at the end. For just a second, when the engine roared, her mask had cracked. She had looked at him not as a mechanic, not as someone to mock, but as a man who had proved her wrong. And that, in its own way, was more unsettling than the insult. Neither of them realized it yet, but the moment in that parking lot wasn't finished. It was only the beginning of a story that would push them both to confront not just each other, but themselves. Marcus didn't expect to see her again. He chalked that day up as just another story to tell, another scar added to the silent collection of insults he'd carried over the years. In his shop, the smell of motor oil and the hiss of air compressors replaced the sting of her words. By the weekend, the Jaguar and its owner were the last things he thought about. Bills, engines, customers, those were his realities. But Melissa Davenport wasn't done with him. At first, she told herself it was business. After all, the Jaguar needed more than a quick fix. A deeper issue lurked beneath the hood. She told herself it was practical to call the same mechanic back, the one who'd solved in minutes what her usual team of specialists had fumbled with for hours. But late that night, when her fingers hovered over the number on the invoice Marcus had left, She knew the truth. It wasn't about the car. It was about the way he hadn't looked at her with awe or fear or hunger for approval. He had looked at her as though she were no one special at all. And that was unbearable. The next week, Marcus heard the familiar voice again on his shop's phone. "It's Davenport," she said crisply, not even bothering with hello. "The Jaguar's acting up again." "You'll come." Marcus almost laughed. He thought of saying no, but money was money, and his rent wasn't going to wait. "Give me the address," he replied. When he pulled up to her penthouse building, the gleaming glass tower looked like a different universe. He parked his battered truck by the service entrance, his coveralls still smudged with grease from a morning job. Walking through the polished lobby, he caught the stares, the security guards sizing him up, a woman clutching her purse tighter, a businessman wrinkling his nose as if the smell of hard work offended him. Marcus was used to it. He kept walking. Melissa was waiting in the underground garage, arms folded, heels clicking against the concrete as she paced. Her Jaguar stood sleek and polished, like a queen's carriage, but her eyes, sharp as ever, softened just slightly when they landed on him. "You took long enough," she said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You called 20 minutes ago." She blinked, caught off guard by the plainness of his tone. People usually scrambled to appease her. He didn't. And for reasons she couldn't explain, that unsettled her more than it should have. As Marcus bent over the engine again, Melissa found herself watching him in silence. The way his hands moved with certainty, the calm steadiness in his posture. It was the opposite of her world, where words flew sharp and every move was about dominance. Here was a man who didn't speak much, who didn't need to. The hum of the engine became his voice. "Tell me something," Melissa said suddenly. Marcus didn't look up. "I'm working." "I know," she pressed, "but tell me, what drives you?" "A man doesn't work with that kind of patience unless he's chasing something." Marcus wiped his hands on a rag, still focused on the bolts. "I'm chasing keeping my shop alive, chasing keeping a promise to my father. Nothing glamorous, nothing you'd understand." Melissa stiffened. The words stung, though she'd asked for honesty. She opened her mouth to retort, to remind him that she had built an empire from nothing, that she knew better than anyone what it meant to chase something. But the words died on her tongue, because beneath his dismissal, she heard something raw, a wound. And for the first time in years, she didn't know how to respond. Over the next few weeks, their paths kept crossing. Melissa's Jaguar seemed cursed, each time pulling her back to Marcus's shop or forcing her to dial his number. At first, she thought fate was mocking her, but slowly she began to suspect it was something else, a thread pulling them into each other's worlds. The more they met, the more their conversations shifted from sharp jabs to uneasy silences, and from silences to reluctant curiosity. Melissa learned about Marcus's father, about his dream of expanding the shop into a training ground for young mechanics. She learned how the banks turned him away, how investors saw only risk where Marcus saw potential. And Marcus, in turn, caught glimpses of Melissa's world, the endless meetings, the partners who praised her in public but undermined her in private, the loneliness hidden in her corner office. But even as something unspoken grew between them, the barriers remained. Melissa's pride was iron and Marcus's dignity was steel. Each time she softened, she would catch herself, pull back, and strike with sarcasm. Each time Marcus began to trust, he would remember her first insult and retreat behind walls of silence. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon. Melissa had insisted on bringing the Jaguar to his shop this time, determined to prove she wasn't above his world. She walked into the garage in heels and a designer dress, her presence as jarring as a diamond in a toolbox. The regulars in the shop, neighbors bringing in their old cars, kids hanging around to watch Marcus work, stared in disbelief. Melissa ignored them all, but inside she felt like an intruder. As Marcus worked, a group of teenage boys loitered by the door, whispering and chuckling. Melissa overheard one of them mutter, "That's Davenport, the one who said she'd marry him if he fixed her car." Guess she didn't mean it. The words struck her like a slap. She glanced at Marcus, expecting him to smirk or throw the insult back at her. But he didn't. He tightened a bolt, straightened, and spoke loud enough for the boys to hear. "Engines don't care who you are," he said. They care if you put in the work. Same with people. The boys quieted. Melissa's chest tightened. She hadn't expected him to defend her. Not after everything. Later, as she watched him wipe the sweat from his brow, she realized something had shifted. For the first time, she wasn't just intrigued by him, she was humbled. And humility was a feeling she barely recognized. Still, pride dies hard. That night, when Marcus handed her the keys, she forced a smirk. Careful, Cole. People might start thinking you actually like me. Marcus looked at her then, his gaze steady, unreadable. Maybe I just see more than what you're showing. She opened her mouth to retort, to remind him that she had built an empire from nothing, that she knew better than anyone what it meant to chase something. But the words died on her tongue, because beneath his dismissal, she heard something raw, a wound. And for the first time in years, she didn't know how to respond. Over the next few weeks, their paths kept crossing. Melissa's Jaguar seemed cursed, each time pulling her back to Marcus's shop or forcing her to dial his number. At first, she thought fate was mocking her, but slowly she began to suspect it was something else, a thread pulling them into each other's worlds. The more they met, the more their conversations shifted from sharp jabs to uneasy silences, and from silences to reluctant curiosity. Melissa learned about Marcus's father, about his dream of expanding the shop into a training ground for young mechanics. She learned how the banks turned him away, how investors saw only risk where Marcus saw potential. And Marcus, in turn, caught glimpses of Melissa's world, the endless meetings, the partners who praised her in public but undermined her in private, the loneliness hidden in her corner office. But even as something unspoken grew between them, the barriers remained. Melissa's pride was iron and Marcus's dignity was steel. Each time she softened, she would catch herself, pull back, and strike with sarcasm. Each time Marcus began to trust, he would remember her first insult and retreat behind walls of silence. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon. Melissa had insisted on bringing the Jaguar to his shop this time, determined to prove she wasn't above his world. She walked into the garage in heels and a designer dress, her presence as jarring as a diamond in a toolbox. The regulars in the shop, neighbors bringing in their old cars, kids hanging around to watch Marcus work, stared in disbelief. Melissa ignored them all, but inside she felt like an intruder. As Marcus worked, a group of teenage boys loitered by the door, whispering and chuckling. Melissa overheard one of them mutter, "That's Davenport, the one who said she'd marry him if he fixed her car." Guess she didn't mean it. The words struck her like a slap. She glanced at Marcus, expecting him to smirk or throw the insult back at her. But he didn't. He tightened a bolt, straightened, and spoke loud enough for the boys to hear. "Engines don't care who you are," he said. "They care if you put in the work." Same with people. The boys quieted. Melissa's chest tightened. She hadn't expected him to defend her. Not after everything. Later, as she watched him wipe the sweat from his brow, she realized something had shifted. For the first time, she wasn't just intrigued by him. She was humbled. And humility was a feeling she barely recognized. Still, pride dies hard. That night, when Marcus handed her the keys, she forced a smirk. "Careful, Cole. People might start thinking you actually like me." Marcus looked at her then, his gaze steady, unreadable. "Maybe I just see more than what you're showing." Her breath caught. She turned away quickly, masking the tremor in her chest. But she knew deep down that this was no longer just about a car. This was about two worlds crashing into each other, about a woman who had built walls too high and a man strong enough not to climb them, but to wait until she opened the gate herself. And as much as Melissa wanted to believe she was still in control, she couldn't shake the fear that for the first time in her life, she might lose a battle she didn't even know she was fighting. The night it all came to a head began innocently enough. Melissa was hosting a gala, one of those glittering corporate events where champagne flowed like water and everyone wore masks, not on their faces but in their carefully chosen words. Her company was unveiling a major partnership with an international investor, and the ballroom at the Davenport Hotel was draped in silver and gold. Crystal chandeliers glowed above the crowd of CEOs, politicians, and journalists. Melissa herself, draped in a sapphire gown, looked every inch the untouchable queen of her empire. But under the mask of confidence, her thoughts kept wandering to a man in coveralls with grease on his hands who had once told her, "Engines don't care who you are." Marcus hadn't been invited. Of course not. Yet fate had its own script. That afternoon, Melissa's Jaguar stalled again, on the very day she had to make her grand entrance. Panicked and pressed for time, her usual fleet of chauffeurs was nowhere in sight. With a groan of frustration, she pulled out her phone and dialed the only number she knew would answer. "Marcus, I need you. Now." He almost didn't come. Something in him had grown tired of being her emergency solution. But then he thought of the way she had looked in his shop that day, when the boys mocked her, and the way she had stayed silent, humbled. Against his better judgment, he showed up. Melissa hadn't expected him to drive her to the gala, but when he handed her the repaired keys and saw the crowd waiting on the red carpet outside, he smirked. "Need a ride?" Her pride bristled, but she nodded. And so the black mechanic drove the powerful CEO to her glittering stage. When they pulled up, the cameras flashed like lightning. Photographers gasped at the sight. Melissa Davenport, stepping out of her Jaguar, with a man who clearly didn't belong in their world holding the door for her. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Melissa ignored them, chin high. Inside the ballroom, the whispers followed. Who is he? Why would she bring someone like that here? Some laughed under their breath. Others sneered openly. And then it happened. One of her rivals, a smug executive named Franklin Hodge, who had always resented Melissa's rise, decided to make a spectacle. With a glass of wine in hand, he raised his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "So this is the famous Marcus, eh? The mechanic who fixed your car. Tell me, Davenport, did he fix your heart too, or just your engine?" Laughter erupted around him, sharp and cutting. Melissa froze. 1,000 eyes bore into her, waiting for her reaction. Her pride screamed at her to dismiss Marcus, to laugh along, to prove she was still untouchable. But then she looked at Marcus, standing there, calm, steady, but with hurt flickering just behind his eyes. He had come here for her. He had endured the stares, the whispers, and now he stood silent while the world mocked him. Something broke inside her. Melissa turned, her voice like steel cutting through glass. "Careful, Franklin. Engines might not matter to you, but this man, he does more honest work in a day than you've done in your whole career. And for the record, yes, he fixed more than my car. He reminded me what integrity looks like. Something money can't buy." The ballroom fell silent. Marcus blinked. He hadn't expected her to defend him, least of all here in front of her empire. But Franklin smirked, unwilling to be defeated. "Oh, please, Melissa. Don't tell me you're serious. What are you going to do, marry the mechanic?" Melissa's heart pounded. She heard the echo of her own cruel words from that first day. "Fix this engine and I'll marry you." The entire room waited. And then, without flinching, she said, "Maybe I should." Gasps rippled like thunder. Cameras clicked. Franklin's smirk collapsed into stunned silence. But Melissa wasn't done. She stepped closer to Marcus, her voice softer now, trembling but firm. "You fixed what no one else could, Marcus. And I don't mean the Jaguar. You fixed the part of me that forgot where I came from. You reminded me that respect has nothing to do with status. And for that, I owe you more than I can ever repay." Marcus stared at her, the weight of her words hanging between them. The ballroom faded. For a moment, it was just the two of them. One woman stripped of her pride, one man standing tall in his dignity. Then the applause began, not from everyone, but from enough. A few executives clapped hesitantly, then others joined, until the sound filled the hall. It wasn't universal. There were still whispers, still sneers. But the tide had shifted. Melissa had crossed the line, and she didn't care. Marcus leaned in, his voice low. "You didn't have to do that." She met his gaze. "Yes, I did." For the first time, Marcus saw not the CEO, not the queen of glass towers, but the woman underneath, the one who, despite all her armor, had found the courage to stand with him in the fire. And in that moment, he realized something. He hadn't just fixed her car, or even her heart. He had changed her soul. The gala ended with whispers that stretched into headlines by morning. CEO defends mechanic in shocking public stand. Melissa Davenport challenges corporate elitism at gala. Some painted her as reckless, others as revolutionary. But Melissa didn't care. For the first time in years, she walked out of a ballroom without her mask. And beside her was Marcus, the man no one expected her to respect, let alone defend. The drive home was silent at first. Melissa sat in the passenger seat, her gown gathered around her knees, watching the city lights flicker past. Marcus's hands rested steady on the wheel, his jaw tight. She could feel the storm in him. Finally, he spoke. "Why'd you do it, Melissa?" Her heart clenched. She had rehearsed every boardroom speech in her life, but she hadn't rehearsed this. "Because I was wrong. That first day in your shop, when I mocked you, I thought I was untouchable. I thought your worth ended with the grease on your hands. But you," her voice caught, "you showed me dignity, Marcus. You showed me what it means to stand tall, even when people try to drag you down." Marcus's grip on the wheel loosened. He glanced at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. For the first time, she wasn't talking like a CEO or a woman trying to prove herself. She was just Melissa, raw, imperfect, and real. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was freeing. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift. Some of Melissa's investors pulled out, claiming she had embarrassed the company. Franklin Hodge led a smear campaign, painting her as unstable for defending a man who didn't belong in their world. But something else happened too. Employees, especially those from working-class backgrounds, started to look at her differently. Secretaries, janitors, junior engineers, they saw a CEO willing to stand up for someone beneath her. Letters began arriving at her office. "Thank you for speaking up. You reminded me my work has value. For once, someone up there saw us." Melissa realized something profound. Her greatest victory wasn't securing billion-dollar deals. It was earning the respect of the people who worked the hardest and got recognized the least. For Marcus, life didn't change overnight. He still opened his shop every morning at 7 a.m., still wiped grease from his hands with the same rag. But customers came with a different tone. Some said, "I saw you in the paper. Good for you, man." Others just shook his hand a little firmer, looked him in the eye with new respect. And one day, Melissa walked into his shop again, not in a designer suit, not with a mocking smile. She wore jeans, a simple blouse, her hair tied back. She sat on the same stool she had mocked him from months ago. "I came to apologize again," she said softly. Marcus chuckled. "Melissa, you've already done more than enough." "No," she insisted. "This isn't about the gala or the headlines. It's about me learning how blind I was. I thought success gave me the right to measure people. You proved me wrong, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure I don't forget it." Marcus studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Good, because respect isn't something you say, it's something you live." Months passed, and the story that began with a cruel joke turned into something deeper. Melissa started a foundation within her company, scholarships for kids in trade schools, grants for small business owners, especially those overlooked because of race or class. She named it the Integrity Fund, inspired by a man who had fixed more than just an engine. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, she insisted Marcus stand beside her. Cameras flashed as she handed him the first honorary plaque. On it were the words, "To those who remind us that true worth is not measured by wealth, but by dignity." Marcus hated the spotlight, but in that moment he stood tall, not because of the recognition, but because Melissa had finally understood. That night, as the crowd dispersed, Melissa turned to Marcus. "Do you remember what I said that first day? That stupid, arrogant joke about marrying you if you fix my car?" Marcus smirked. "Hard to forget." She took a deep breath. "Well, I know I don't deserve to say this, but maybe one day I'll earn the right to mean it." Marcus froze, not because of the words, but because of the humility in them. This wasn't the same woman who had once looked down on him. This was someone transformed, stripped of ego, rebuilt in compassion. He smiled, shaking his head. "Melissa, you've already come farther than I ever thought you would." They didn't need a fairy tale ending. Not yet. What they had was something stronger. Respect, hard-won, and real. And as the lights dimmed over the city, the story of a mechanic and a CEO lingered as more than gossip, more than spectacle. It became a lesson whispered in boardrooms and workshops alike. That dignity cannot be mocked, that respect is the engine of change, and that sometimes the people we underestimate most are the very ones who fix what's broken inside us. Melissa learned, Marcus endured, and together they proved that even in a world obsessed with power, humility and respect remain the most radical acts of all.